Chapter 16. Mopple Looks Sinister. A little later, Othello had assembled the flock around the hill. It was the first time they had seen the black ram putting his heart into something like that. All the same, they still weren't sure. It was one thing to get used slowly to Melmoth's strange scent, admiring him for his adventures and his courage. Letting him teach them things was something else again. After all, Melmoth talked almost like a goat, and every suckling lamb knows that goats are crazy. Melmoth had placed himself on top of the hill where they could all see him. A hot wind was blowing through his shaggy fleece, making the wool ripple like trembling gray flames. His horns shone in the sunlight. "Who is your worst enemy?" asked Melmoth. "The butcher, Gabriel, the master hunter, the wolf," bleated the sheep in chorus. There had been so many enemies recently that they hardly knew how to choose between them. "The abyss," said Zora philosophically. "Wrong," said Melmoth. "You are your own worst enemy. Stout and lazy, cowardly and scared, thoughtless and simple-minded. That's you." Well, now it was out at last. Melmoth was definitely crazy. A waste of time to listen to him while Gabriel was whetting the knife. And yet none of them dared turn their backs on him. "Disbelief," said Melmoth. "That'll do to start with. You shouldn't believe what you don't understand. You should understand what you believe. My friend Othello, the four-horned, black, bold-eyed Othello, will help you to understand." Othello trotted up the hill to join Melmoth, who signaled to him with his eyes. Othello began to graze. The sheep watched him for a while, impatiently, because they weren't supposed to be grazing themselves. "What you see is a sheep grazing," said Melmoth after some time, lost in thought as he hunts the green grass down, dreamily roaming in the meadow. And now, here Melmoth signaled to Othello again. "You see a sheep paying attention to his grazing, tense as a cat about to spring, all his senses spying through the grass, feelers out in all directions, all the way up to the sky." Othello grazed with fervor. The sheep looked at him enviously. "What's the difference?" Melmoth suddenly asked. They thought about it. "His ears," said Zora. "They twitched more often." "He's lowered his horns further," bleated Lane. "He's not wagging his tail as much," said Heather. "His scent," bleated Maud vaguely. You could seldom go wrong with scent. "Wrong," said Melmoth. "Wrong, wrong, and wrong again." "His nostrils," said Sarah. "His nostrils are distended." "Wrong," said Melmoth. "His fodder," bleated Mopple. "He's eating different things. More clover, less oat grass." "Wrong." "There isn't any difference," said Mabel. "Wrong." "Right," said Melmoth, looking at the sheep with sparkling eyes. "You're learning that the sheep who pays attention sees, but is not seen. The only ones who can make sure you pay attention are yourselves. If you forget about it, you're your own worst enemies, because there is a difference after all. When he pays attention, Othello survives." "But Gabriel," Sarah began, but Melmoth interrupted her. "Paying attention will help you to track down the two legs, hairless thoughts, noisy hypocrites, scent deceivers, but there's nothing they can do if you pay attention." Melmoth studied the sheep's faces to see if they had understood him. Thanks to George's explanations, however, the sheep had had plenty of practice in looking intelligent, and Melmoth realized that he couldn't find out what they were thinking so easily. When most of the sheep had given up hope, the practical part of the lesson began. The first exercise was to glare at a large round stone with as much attention as they could. "But stones aren't dangerous," Heather objected. "Don't fool yourself," growled Melmoth. "If a stone flies at your head, it It can kill you. Melmoth chuckled, as if at a very good joke. Heather jumped away from the stone in alarm. The whole point is that we think the stone isn't dangerous, Melmoth explained. Every lamb pays attention once it realizes its own skin is at risk. The sheep stared at the stone with concentrated attention, and if the stone hadn't been a stone, it would surely have melted under their piercing gaze like a patch of snow in spring. While the sheep were paying attention to the stone, the heat of the day broke in a mighty storm above them. The stone was wet with rain and shone in the lightning flashes. Thunder rolled, and the sheep were drenched. Heather was the first to lose patience. I don't want to pay attention anymore, she grumbled. I want to learn to herd sheep like you. I want to learn to be dangerous. You won't be able to herd anyone until you can herd yourself, said Melmoth. And you're dangerous already. A danger to yourself. Once you've learned not to be a danger to yourself, you'll be a danger to everyone else. Simple, isn't it? That afternoon, not all the sheep learned what Melmoth described as the art of paying attention, nostril broad, wide as the sky. But all the sheep learned something. Maud learned that she could sleep with her eyes open in broad daylight. Mopple learned that it was possible to go a whole afternoon without grazing. Sarah learned how to shoo flies away by twitching and jerking various muscles without moving her ears, and Heather learned to keep quiet. Melmoth was pleased with that for a start. Later, in the fragrant air washed clean by the storm, he began setting them practical exercises. They were to walk right along the cliff tops, paying attention to every step. Melmoth supervised this exercise from Zora's ledge. Later, he sent the sheep to steal Gabriel's dripping wet shepherd's hat from the steps of the caravan, where he had left it when he ran into the hay barn for shelter from the cloudburst. The sheep learned faster than they understood. They realized that if they watched everything with the amount of attention required by Melmoth, they had very little time to feel afraid. Of course, not everything worked. During one of Melmoth's mock attacks, Mopple was paying attention so hard that he forgot to swerve aside and was run down. Heather choked while grazing because she was paying so much attention that she swallowed the wrong way. As evening came on, Melmoth taught them something very un-sheep-like. He taught them not to let themselves be herded. But that's impossible, bleated Lane. It just happens. It's in your legs. It happens because you let it happen, said Melmoth. They can herd you only because you can't herd yourselves. Forget the flock. Forget the dogs. Herd yourselves. The sheep practiced not letting themselves be herded until twilight fell. Melmoth had taken over the role of sheepdog and galloped around them, bleating frantically. A whirlwind of mock attacks, feints, and sudden withdrawals. Their job was simply to stand still. They felt exhausted, some from instinctively running away, others from heroically standing still. Will we soon be finished? Asked Maud. Finished with what? Melmoth looked guilelessly at Maud. Finished with all this learning stuff, bleated Sarah. No, said Melmoth. Then when will we be finished? Groaned Mopple. His sinews were aching and his back was stiff. Oddly, he didn't feel hungry. Well rounded round, said Melmoth. Look at Melmoth, who has traveled the world in search of the knack of paying attention, and believe him when he tells you there hasn't been a day in his life when he didn't learn something, or a night either. Mopple groaned. Now they could forget about their usual good night's rest too. He prepared for another set of stressful lessons, but Melmoth hadn't finished yet. On the other hand, he said, you can learn while you're grazing, and even in your sleep. You'd better go on learning while you graze now. The sheep were quick to agree that grazing Evening twilight was an excellent method of learning. Later, they trotted off to the hay barn to go on learning in their sleep. But although they were tired, as they had seldom been before, they found it difficult to drop off. A drizzle was rustling through the leaves of the hedges in the darkness. They stood there exhausted, thinking about strange rams and wandering sheep, stones and shepherds' hats, neat breeds and wire fences, all mixed up together. An owl hooted, and even that made them nervous. Then something crunched near the door. The sheep crowded together in a corner, but it was only Melmoth appearing like a black shadow in the doorway of the barn. "You're not learning," he said. "You're not asleep. What's wrong?" "Yeah," said Maud. "Here," bleated the other sheep. "Here," said Melmoth. "It's not in here. It's there, outside, isn't it?" He was right. Somewhere outside were Gabriel, the butcher, and all the world's meat-eaters. "You must drive it away," said Melmoth. "It's an exercise. You'll find out how useful paying attention is." And once again, Melmoth gave them exercises to do. Sarah, Cloud, and Maud were to stand in the dark black shadows under the crow's tree, listening to the birds thinking their night thoughts. Ramses, Lane, and Cordelia must go to the hole under the pine tree and listen to the cold sea and the depths below, muttering threats to the cliffs. Zora was to stare at the sky and imagine it didn't go up and up, but down into a sky-wide abyss. Heather was to stay in the hay barn by herself and pick up the scent of silence in the nooks and crannies. And Othello, Maple, and Mopple were to go into the village, find the butcher, and watch him until they weren't afraid of him anymore. It was still drizzling. Raindrops ran like beads down the window pane. Caught inside each drop was a trembling spark of light from the room on the other side of the pane. Miss Maple, Mopple, and Othello peered through the raindrops. Inside, God and the butcher were sitting at a table together. Between them stood a brown bottle and 2 glasses of golden liquid. Ham had propped his chin on his huge butcher's paws and was staring at God. God dipped his nose into his glass of liquid. "All just vanity," he said. "Female vanity. They dye their hair. They wear those tight-fitting clothes, and we're not supposed to notice. It's not right, so it isn't." "Kate doesn't dye her hair," said Ham. "All natural. And what a colour, too." "Not right," said God. "And it makes me feel so bad. It torments my soul. It makes me feel so bad. Understand?" "Listen here," said the butcher. "If I'm drinking with you, just imagine the bad state I must be in." God nodded, understanding. "You don't think I like you, do you? You've made my life hell for years, you have, and all because of that." He shook his head sadly. "But I have to tell someone, see," said the butcher, "or I'll go crazy." His voice sounded oddly thick and slurred. Perhaps it was just because of the glass pane between them. "If George was still alive, I'd have gone to him. George could keep his mouth shut. You have to give him that. Not that it did him much good in the end, poor devil. And you'll keep your mouth shut too, old friend. You will keep your mouth shut, whether you like it or not." The long-nosed man smiled wryly. "Frailty of the flesh. Do you know what it's like telling folk about heaven day after day, knowing all the time you're expected down in hell? Expected, did I say? I get visits from the folk down there in person." "You think I fell off those cliffs all by myself, do ya? Just like that? You think old Ham is getting shaky on his feet?" Ham glared angrily at God. This was not the reaction that the other man expected. For a moment he fixed his eyes on the butcher. Then he nodded his head several times with great emphasis, looking like a huge turkey as he did so. Straight from hell they come. Terrible they are, weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth for all eternity, and all because of the sins of the flesh. We have to repent them. It's meet it's meet and right and our bounden duty. Maple and Mopple looked at each other. It seemed as if the long-nosed man had understood what was wrong with the butcher's job. Meat and right? The butcher himself, naturally, remained unimpressed. I mean, they was only sheep, he said. I'd never have slaughtered a horse, nor a donkey neither. Donkeys, well, they'd have a cross on their backs and their coats. Carry the Lord on Palm Sunday, a donkey did. That's a sign. But sheep, that's what they're for. Bred for it. And all that. You don't need to have a guilty conscience, I told myself. A nice clean death. And off into the shop window, simple as that. But then, and Ham's sausage fingers drummed a wild rhythm on the table. God said nothing. A small clear drop was hanging from his nose, quivering like dew in the wind. Ham's fingers stopped drumming. For a moment it was so quiet that the sheep could hear the rain in the windowsill, fine and nervous like scurrying mice. Then Ham reached for the bottle and filled his glass to the brim with golden liquid. The bottle glugged. Ham shook his head. George, he said. Now he was different. Gave him names, funny names. Talked to them. Never got on properly with no one else. Once he comes to me, and he says, Melmoth's gone 3 days ago. That's long enough. We'll take your dogs and track 'em down. Oh, I thought at first he meant some kid or other. The butcher shook his head, laughing. Crazy, but he was all right, was George. Better than the rest of 'em put together. George, the long-nosed man, had grabbed the brown bottle jealously, staring at the butcher. You don't believe that, do you? We'll never know for sure what he got up to in that caravan, but I can tell you one thing. It wasn't only sheep he dealt in, right? Huh. God rolled his eyes. He took a deep draught from his golden glass and coughed. His eyes popped out from between their lids, all moist. George always making trouble for me. No respect, not a God-fearing man, and you know the worst of it. Once they finally get me down there, I'll be seeing him again. Don't think it's just chance, do ya? He set them on me, avenging demons. Why doesn't he set them on others? They're all deeper in than me. I only kept my mouth shut, that's all. But no, of course he bears me a grudge. No, when I saw the first one at his funeral, the mourners left sharpish. Anyone could see they had better things to do than watch George put underground. So I'm just, well, comes to the same thing now. I'm just looking at one of those magazines only for a moment, and then I hear something. I look up, and there it is, a skull grinning at me right over George's gravestone, tall as a man, but the head was the head of a... God's unsteady voice disappeared into his glass and came out shortly afterwards as a hoarse whisper. The head of a ram looked at me straight in the eye, a black ram with 4 horns. Ham nodded vigorously. A white ram it was, he said. Came at me, pushed me off the cliff top. Huge it was, strong as a boar. Wild, too. Is that normal now? I mean, they're only sheep, and now that one, bright, white, shone in the mist. I'll tell you one thing, that was no normal sheep. But why? I've been seeing him ever since, wondering why. The butcher drank deeply from his own glass. God blew his nose on a handkerchief. I could have coped with that, he muttered. I burned that magazine and I prayed. But then, very next day, that new tourism woman came to see me. We found one at last, and I was to show her around. Well, I only looked at her, and I suppose even that was too sinful for them. Anyway, up comes a demon at the window, in the shape of a ram again. Not a black one, no, a grey one, with huge great horns and black wings, tall as a man standing upright. Of course, I sent the woman straight off again. I sent her to Beth. I can tell you, I'll never be able to set eyes on a sheep again without cold shudders running down my back. The butcher tipped the rest of the golden liquid into his mouth and looked sympathetically at God. Me neither, he said. I've thought and thought about it. They told me I only spent one night in hospital, but it felt like weeks. I thought the whole time, Kate. Well, yes, I never could forget her, even though she up and married George. That's why I bought the CCTV camera, so I could look at her again in the evenings, see her coming to buy her turkey breast, and... The butcher stared dreamily into space. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife. But I never touched her, never. You have to believe me. So, what else was there? I didn't even join in that bad business with McCarthy, and he did me more harm than anyone. The only reason I can think of it is the slaughtering, but someone's got to do it. The butcher slammed his empty glass back on the table. And now it's all avenged, whispered the long-nosed man. Every sinful thought, every single one, even in church. Think of that, in the house of God. I was in the confessional. There was something I wanted to discuss with Gabriel. He came along, we spoke, and then, oh, the horror of it. The horror. All of a sudden, the confessional was full of this hellish stink. The voice changes to a terrible bleating. I pull the curtain back, and instead of Gabriel, I see the black ram, with his jaws grinding away, 7-horned, like the beast of the apocalypse. He sobbed. Ham put his fingertips against each other, a vault of thick pink ribs, and spoke in a very matter-of-fact tone. Either it was wrong to slaughter them, he said, and know I'm guilty, in which case this here is just. His hands touched the wheelchair. Or it was right, and this here is an injustice, crying out to heaven. Now it doesn't say anywhere that it's wrong, not in the whole Bible. There's not a word about it. They slaughter animals in the Bible, too. Vengeance, breathed the long-nosed man, shuddering. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. That's what I ought to have told him back then over the McCarthy business. It was up to me. Too late. Vengeance. And now it's up to them down there. God's hand gestured miserably in the direction of the floor. There's only 2 ways about it, said Ham. Either I turn vegetarian, like Beth, or I show them you don't play around with me like that. A white ram. Yes, just a dumb animal, instinct and all that. So I tell myself sometimes, but then I'm only a dumb animal too. Everything we see, it's kind of just like, I mean, in a way, like masks. Know what I mean? There'll be something behind them. I don't know what, but I know it was a white ram. I can get hold of him. I'll pay him back for it. Ham leaned his hands on the table as if he were going to get up, but he raised himself only a little way from his peculiar chair and then collapsed back into it, sighing. Suddenly, something moved beside Maple. Gravel crunched. Mopple the whale had retreated from the window pane and was eyeing the garden gate. Maple looked at him sternly. Melmoth said only until we weren't afraid anymore. Sorry. Melmoth said only until we weren't afraid anymore, said Mopple, trying to look fearless. But it's important, said Maple. Maybe they'll talk about George. Maybe we'll find out something about the murder, and you're the memory sheep. At that moment, there was a crash inside the butcher's house, a harsh, cold sound with a frightened echo. Mopple jumped. There, said Maple encouragingly. Something's happened. Come on, you'll have to remember it. In the darkness, the slats of the garden fence looked like sharp teeth, and the garden gate creaked with a hostile sound in the wind. Suddenly, the lonely way back through the night didn't seem such a good idea after all. Mopple pushed his way back into the safe place between Maple and Othello and stared bravely through the pane. Inside, the bottle had fallen over. The liquid was gurgling as it ran out. The long-nosed man was clutching his glass. Ham was staring, fascinated at the puddles spreading on the tabletop, as dark as blood. It's not about your wretched little soul, he said, in a very quiet voice. It sounded more dangerous than anything they had heard the butcher say before. Sin or no sin, do penance, and the Lord will forgive you. Don't you believe any of the stuff you spout every Sunday? Oh, I'm not interested in your stupid chastity. It's because you didn't mind about Alice afterwards. That's the bad part. And I'll make you sweat for it as long as I can. The sheep could see how the butcher's anger was taking God's attention away from his glass again. He sat up straight. She left me, he said soberly and sadly. Not the other way around, no. What wouldn't I have done for her? Anything. Even now, I see her in every woman I set eyes on. That's my fate. That witch. The butcher's hands clenched into fists. The joints cracked menacingly. Mopple nervously twitched his ears. Witch? All my sister asked for was a little honesty. In the face of the butcher's cold fury, the long-nosed man slumped back in his chair again. You don't know all I do for you, he wailed. Do you think they've never thought of getting you out of the way? Who persuaded them not to, with the tongues of men and angels? Me. And then one of those smart fellows worked out how useful it would be if your chain was found at the scene of the crime. Kate's gold chain, he grinned. Thank the Lord he confessed to it. I went straight off to find the thing. You mean Josh, said Ham, sounding almost bored. God raised his eyebrows in surprise. You know? All I know is I still had it on when Tom called me to the pub. And then, when we came back to George's body, it was gone. Obviously, someone wanted to pin something on me. Who else would it be? Josh, that rat. Doesn't like me, doesn't ask me why. The butcher shook his head thoughtfully. You should never have thrashed him like that after George's wedding, said God. Well, the butcher snarled at him. Did you find my chain? No, admitted God, but I tried to. Just because you know that if something happens to me, it will all come out, said the butcher scornfully. Then go ahead and do it. The long-nosed man was trying a bold approach again. nailed my love letters to the church door, if anyone's even interested now, after so many years." "Believe you me," said Ham grimly, "they'll be interested." God sipped nervously from his glass. "I don't envy you, listening to confessions week after week," muttered Ham after a while. "The stuff they must have to tell you. A spade! Who'd dreamed up such a thing?" He shook his head. God leaned far over the table, so far that it looked as if he was about to topple forward, and stared at Ham, while the butcher had slowly collapsed back in his wheelchair. God seemed quite alert again. No one said anything. No one. Not a word. Not even in the confessional. McCarthy, oh yes, I've heard all about that. But George, not a word. They thought about it, yes, but no one says they did it. Ham shrugged his shoulders, as if that didn't particularly surprise him. But the other man was getting more agitated with every word. "The silence, Ham. It makes my blood run cold. Even before God they won't. I really wish they would confess. This isn't like them, you know. They were always mad keen to unload their guilty consciences on me. Perhaps, that with the spade is sick." A crafty look came into his eyes. "Wait a minute," he said. "How come you were back at the scene of the crime again, on the day of George's funeral?" Ham made a face. Apparently, he didn't like to think back to that misty morning. Eyes glazed, he stared out of the window, straight into Mopple's brown eyes. "Because I wanted my chain back," he growled. "I had the same idea as you, even without confessions. That idiot Josh. And when the police didn't turn up to see me, I thought it must still be there." Ham's eyes fixed on something, fell silent. God laughed. "Ha, ha, ha, ha. And Josh must have been looking for it too, at just the same time, remorse and so on. He didn't find anything either. Seems to be a jinx on this whole thing. And in my opinion..." God fell silent too when he saw the frozen horror on Ham's face. Following the butcher's gaze to the window, God too froze. He turned very pale, and his left hand went to his chest. "There he is," shouted Ham. "I'll get him now." With a skillful movement, Ham turned his wheelchair and raced it to the door. God was staring in amazement at the black rectangle, where for just a moment 3 sheep's heads had been visible, bathed in reddish light. Mopple, Maple, and Othello trotted back to their meadow in the drizzle. They had good reason to feel pleased with themselves. If they hadn't entirely banished their own fear, at least they had scared God and the butcher. Othello trotted proudly ahead. He had impressed God with his 4 horns. The whole thing was worth it for that alone. Even Mopple trotted through the night with his head held high. Melmoth was right. With a little attention and a fearless sheepy gaze, you could really terrify human beings. Deep in contemplation of his newly discovered abilities, Mopple had set a brisk pace and was now trotting shoulder to shoulder with Othello. He was about to fall a couple of timid steps back when Othello turned his head and looked at him. "So, you pushed the butcher off the cliffs?" he asked. Mopple raised his head. To think of the way he'd attacked the butcher in the mist, strong as a boar. With a little attention, a sheep really could do anything. But then his memory switched in. Mopple was the memory sheep. He had remembered everything. "No," he sighed. "He was chasing me through the mist, and then he fell." Othello snorted in amusement, but his face was friendly. "Quite an achievement all the same," he said. They looked round for Miss Maple, who had dropped a little way behind. Now and then, lost in thought, She stopped to eat a few leaves from the hedges along the path over the fields. The rams waited patiently.